So here we are, part 3 of the 9800 X3D analysis videos. And in this one, we're looking at benchmarking VR. This is complicated. There's a reason why no one does this. I made an introduction video to VR benchmarking that is very relevant. I'm not going to spend too much time describing the graphs. I assume you already understand them. So check out this video. You can skip to about the 1 minute 46 second mark. And that's a great introduction to what we're going to be talking about today, because I have bar graphs, area charts, I've got a whole bunch of colors. It's going to be confusing if you have no idea about this previous video. So please check that out. Okay, the next part is that I'm only talking about iRacing today. It is very difficult to do VR benchmarking, let alone across 5 different motherboards and 10 processors. I can't do 5, 6 simulators at the same time. It's too much work. I'll just confuse myself and I'll confuse you. So we're gonna go one simulator at a time. Now, I'm fully aware that 60% of you are using a Meta headset, a Rift, an Oculus, a Quest, whatever you wanna call it, 60%. And the only issue with catering just to that audience is that I can't get the same performance telemetry and data out of that headset just because of how it functions, how it's being encoded on the computer and then streamed to the headset. That just totally screws up the performance numbers. That's why I'm using a Valve Index today. What I am showing is relevant data to you. I'm trying to distinguish between GPU and CPU performance and the impact in iRacing when it comes to leaning too hard into one and the other, and what happens. So that analysis is only possible because of a headset like the Valve Index. So that's why I'm using it. So let's look at a real-time example of this. So let's go to my most grueling wet race, Portimao GT3. And on the right-hand side, I have FPS VR, which shows a bunch of numbers, including FPS, the GPU usage, and the CPU frame time, which is kind of scrolling by. Now, as the race goes green and we go down the pit straight, watch what happens here. Whoa, we're getting big, chunky CPU frame time spikes that are demolishing our FPS. I want to show this example because of a chicken and an egg situation or a cause and effect complication. What happened first? Is it a GPU issue or a CPU issue? At a glance, you might think, oh, it must be CPU related. I mean, that's where the spikes were, weren't they? But now, as the next issue comes around, look in the purple box. This is our GPU usage. It seems to me that as this value approaches the threshold of the graphics card, around 95%, that's when we run into the CPU frame time issues. Or maybe with the rain and the settings I've selected, I've created an insurmountable compute for, in this case, the 9800 X3D, and it can't overcome it. That's also possible. And just by circumstance, the 4080 Super is banging off 95%. It's tricky to tell the difference. What you can try to control is the headroom available. Avoiding stutters, avoiding underperformance in VR means scaling your resolution and reducing your graphics qualities so that you're able to have plenty of headroom, not just with the GPU, but also with the CPU. There's lots of anecdotal evidence online, and just because something worked for one other person on a completely different computer than yours, running different car series, different tracks, different weather, all that stuff, just because it worked for them doesn't mean those setting changes will work for you. That's the biggest frustration of all of this. And if you have sudden dramatic loss in VR performance overnight, most likely it has nothing to do with iRacing. You have to validate all of your assumptions. Did your graphics card drivers update? What background applications are you running? Did Windows update and reset things you had disabled? Do you have USB conflicts with your peripherals? And for the love of the sim racing gods, uninstall your RGB software. Okay, now that I've done ranting, let's move into the benchmarks. Here are the 10 CPUs we're benching today, 6 AMD, 4 Intel. The benched average max boost is from my last video, so just there for reference, and the prices. When we look at the motherboard, it's pretty standard affair. I don't have anything fancy. The memory is also fairly inexpensive, so I think that represents a mainstream user for sure. And then last, we have the software and shared hardware configuration. Unless otherwise stated, the valve index is running at 170 supersampling, which equates to 2628 by 2920 per eye, 90 hertz. I benchmarked the CPUs using 2 replays and 1 live run around Daytona with 40 AI. Here's the graphics configuration, and it's pretty high, not gonna lie. The big thing for the CPU comes the draw all cars, but I am drawing minimum pits. I'm only using 2 mirrors. If you want to use more than that, prepare to make some sacrifices elsewhere. I decided to use 2 times MSAA to decrease the GPU burden, but I left other things, foliage off, but I left other things set pretty high, like shader quality, HDR. The point is the benchmark, the CPU, not optimized for the smoothest driving experience. All right, so up first is going to be my Zandvoort replay. This is the bar chart for all of the CPUs. We're looking at the average FPS in white, and the green represents the on-time delivery percentage for the CPUs. Obviously, we want that to be 100%. Each CPU has its own color, so the 9800X3D is red, the 7800X3D is green, and so on. And there are some rounding errors. Note with the 5800X3D, its average FPS was above 90. The 13700K, despite having a flawless run, is slightly below 90. So there's a bit of wiggle room here too. So you can treat this as a litmus test. Basically, everything from the 12600K is performing the same, according to this chart. And beneath it, the 9700K, well, different story. But if we want to understand just how fast the 9800X3D is, how much headroom it has, we have to look at a frame time chart, like this. Using the same colors as shown in the bar graph, here are the X3D chips. The red 9800X3D clearly stands out amongst the other two. Its CPU frame times were delivered all beneath 7 milliseconds, while the 5800X3D in orange trails all the way out to 10, 11. And we see the green 7800X3D comfortably sitting in between the two. I think this chart just clearly represents the generational jump in performance between these processors. When we add in the remaining AMD processors, we see the yellow 7600 just able to deliver perfect performance, but the 5600 and 3600 both struggle with significant tails or delayed frames occurring after 11.1 milliseconds, that 90 hertz line. So let's switch over to Intel and see how these chips perform. The 13700K clearly stands out from its peers as being the best processor here, and the 12600K is just able to get its frames beneath that danger line in yellow. So what I'll do now is I'll add in the bar chart to the top here so you can see all of the processors, and I'll show the modern processors in the frame time chart. I'm excluding the ones you can't buy new today. Now, debatably, you can't buy a 5800X3D new, or maybe even a 7800X3D new, but you get my point. Seeing everything in one shot, I think it establishes a couple things. First of all, the 9800X3D is outrageous. It's way ahead. But if you're on AM4 or LGA 1700 and you don't have the top processors like a 5700X3D or like a 13700K, 14700K, there's real value in upgrading on those platforms and getting more VR performance. I also want to show the GPU frame time chart because it's important to show that the processors that struggle drag out the GPU as well. Ultimately, the graphics card receives the instructions from the CPUs. So if those instructions are late, it's going to be late with its work and gets out of sync. Speaking of GPU frame times, I also benchmarked 4 video cards with the 9800X3D in this scenario, Zandvoort, IMSA, 40 cars. The 4080 Super, the 3080 Ti, and the 7900 XTX were all able to easily deliver their frame times before the 11.1 millisecond mark for 90 hertz. The 3060 Ti, not so much. This resolution is just too high, and the graphic options too difficult. I am often asked, what does a 4070 Super perform like, or a 4070 Ti? And my 3080 Ti is your reference point. It's in the ballpark of those GPUs. So whenever you see it, use that as your reference. What might be a bit more surprising is looking at the CPU frame times from the 9800X3D when using these graphics cards. The three GeForce products, they all put a similar load on the CPU. There's a little asterisk next to that, and I'll talk about it in a second. But what does stand out is the 7900 XTX. It doesn't have the SPS technology that NVIDIA has made. I've made a video about this. You can check it out. iRacing has implemented this technology so that GeForce cards can draw two scenes from one CPU instruction set, unlike the Radeon, which has to receive two instruction sets from the CPU, one for the left eye, one for the right eye. Now, back to the 3060 Ti. The reason why it looks this close is because I don't have motion smoothing enabled or adaptive or dynamic resolution. And the 3060 Ti's performance is so poor that it actually triggers Valve's legacy asynchronous reprojection, where it just halves the frame rate to 45 because it can't attain anything higher than that anyway. So now let's take a trip to Daytona and my live laps performed at sunset, so headlights are on. I've got the cheat sheet top right corner with the bar graphs, but in the frame time chart, I'm just showing the X3D processors. Drawing all cars at a road oval is a terrible idea, and I think that's a huge consequence to the FPS here. It definitely affects the 5800X3D, but the 7800X3D and 9800X3D are able to fight through and deliver on-time performance. In fact, the 9800X3D has extra headroom available. I mean, most of its frame times are beneath 9 seconds, and that's super impressive for a very difficult situation. Here are the other three AMD processors. I think the Ryzen 7600 gets pretty close. I think if we did some tweaks to the settings, this one would be dialed in, but as it is, it does struggle. And I'm always amazed when I see a chart like this, and the idea that the 3600 Ryzen is on the same platform as the 5800 X3D. I mean, if you run simulators, you gotta try and get an X3D chip on AM4. Switching to Intel, and we see a pretty good performance from the 13700K. Only 2% of its frame times are late. Maybe those would be slight stutters in the headset. Very difficult to tell because its average FPS is 89.9. I'm surprised to see as big of a difference between the 9700K and the 10600K. I almost wonder if this is 8 versus 6 cores because performance-wise, they should be pretty close on a clock-to-clock basis. And when we look up at the bar charts, we actually see the 9700K beat out the Ryzen 5600. But we are running live laps against the AI in this situation, so maybe those extra threads, those extra cores help out there. Looking at all of the modern processors with one view here, we clearly see that 9800X3D stand out among them. It's an impressive processor, without a doubt. Next up is the insane torture test of heavy rain at Portimao with about 30 GT3 cars. I've used this benchmark repeatedly. It is so difficult to render, and well, these results show that even the 9800 X3D cannot resolve this situation. The bulk of its frame times that are delivered on time, to the left of the yellow line, look much better than the 7800 X3D. However, if you look at the train of late frames going to the right of the 90 hertz line, those look very similar between the 7800 and the 9800 X3D. During the intro of this video, I showed some graphic card interference with this benchmark, and I think that's what we're looking at here. I also have a theory that maybe SPS is not playing nice with us, but I would have to do a lot more testing to figure that out. As you can tell by the bar graph, I don't think it makes much sense to talk about the older processors, so let's just skip towards all the modern processors. Here's the rainbow spaghetti, and this serves as a good reminder that we had lots of headroom at Zandvoort in the sun, but in the rain at Portimao, not so much. If I was personally tuning my graphic card settings to be adaptable to both scenarios, I would be willing to run a virtual mirror that I toggle on off in the rain. You can also change the number of cars that you're drawing in the sim without restarting it. And if you have time before the race starts to do a simulation restart, you can change your MSAA, and then I'd be willing to change the render resolution as well. And just for quick reference, here are the GPU frame times, and you can see that all of the spaghettis, all of the colors, they trail past that 90 hertz line. It's also worth noting something curious with the 13700K, how it has a higher average FPS in the top chart compared to the 7800 and this 9800X3D, but its CPU on time delivery is worse. And if we look back down to the GPU frame time chart, we see the light blue 13700K. Yeah, it's doing better than the X3Ds, the red, the green, and the orange. I don't have a theory for this, but I think it's another example that when the X3Ds have a graphics card that's overwhelmed, they actually underperform. And I'm not talking single screen overwhelmed. I'm talking about multiple projections, triple monitors, and in this case, VR. Something's not playing nice with that 3D V cache. At least that's what I'm seeing. All of today's testing was also performed with Windows 11 23H2. I did complete 24H2 testing, but I found the results to be inconclusive because I was also testing Windows Core isolation, and in the motherboard BIOS, testing SVM and SMT. The results were a little all over the place. I just couldn't present anything that I could draw conclusions from. So that would require additional testing and a more narrow focused video. Anyways, I'd love to hear your feedback. Please use the comments below. I also would love to have your support either by subscription or if you go to my Patreon, that would be awesome. And I'm thinking of doing Automobilista 2 as the next virtual reality test, especially because the 1.6 update just came out. If there are testing scenarios you want to see, post them in the comments below. So yeah, thanks again, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video and catch you on the next one.